All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, I should have known better than to take a vacation the week after Christmas. Usually, you can assume it's a dead time in Washington. Instead, it actually turned out to be one of the most consequential weeks in modern history of Washington policymaking. And the ultimate end state, we ended up, I'm sure you all know, is that the $2,000 checks are probably dead. But it's worth pausing here in the new year, taking stock of exactly how we got here, the lessons that we're going to learn, and we can keep in mind who the real enemies of the people are today. Things, of course, started before we took off back in mid-December when Senators Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders sought to force a vote on the floor of the U.S. Senate to increase the direct payments number up to $2,000. They had leverage, and they used it. But ultimately, McConnell, even Schumer, and other Democrats wanted to fund the government so badly that they steamrolled them and they kept the check limit at $600. And it passed. Everyone jetted home to their mansions, patting themselves on the back, all help that they could give people. But then, of course, Trump somehow emerged from the shadows to do the first good thing that he's done in a long time, which was demand $2,000 to every American man, woman, and child for the suffering that they've undergone in this pandemic. Washington panicked. The House of Representatives did something you never see them do, which is actually vote for something good, a clean extension of $2,000 to every American. And I'll admit, for a brief moment, I had hope. I thought, oh man, Trump threw the full force of MAGA behind this. Even freaking Nancy Pelosi didn't play any games. She increased the amount without attaching some BS diversity initiative. The vast majority of American people are for this thing. Not even Mitch McConnell can hold this thing up. Yeah, I probably should have been more cynical and trusted my instincts. So what happened? Well, McConnell, of course, blocked it in a particularly ingenious way. He bundled up the $2,000 checks with repeal of Section 230 reform for big tech companies and some whatever on election fraud. Of course, that nukes the bill. Sadly, it actually satisfies all sides of this debate. Democrats can rightfully point to Mitch McConnell's antics, and they can say, hey, look, see, Mitch wouldn't do anything. Republicans can use their fake concerned voice and say, what, Democrats, you don't care about reining in big tech companies and probing election fraud? What's the end result? You get totally and completely screwed. It's the most classic Washington game. When you have something immensely popular that you want to kill, but you can't just do it outright, you attach a bunch of politically divisive crap to it, and then you blame your opponents for playing games with something popular. That's it. As of this writing, the checks are dead. Will it come back? I highly doubt it, since Trump threw all his leverage away and he signed the omnibus spending bill, and now he's just going to rage tweet about election fraud for the next 18 days of his presidency. So yeah, screw Mitch McConnell. There's no both siding this one. It's literally all his fault so that he can worship at the false idol of deficit hawkery. But there is such an important lesson that I want you all to take away from this. Actually forcing change is possible, and I'll point down to the races in Georgia. David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler both suck. Let's all admit it. Neither are good politicians. They're cookie-cutter Republicans. If they get elected, it's because people just hate the left more than they're willing to hate the right. This is basically the dynamic for the majority of the Republican Party right now. When they win elections, it's as a bulwark against the cultural left, not an affirmation of their economic agenda. Usually, this gives cover to corporate ghouls of all stripes. As long as they say the right thing on abortion or defund the police, you're in the clear. You can oppose widely popular economic programs which would actually materially change people's lives in America. Perdue is actually the perfect example of this. The multimillionaire senator, some sketchy stock dealings in his past that usually he can just paper on over. But now he's up for re-election. And Georgia voters, like all voters, support larger checks to the American people. So when Nancy Pelosi passed an actually clean $2,000 check legislation through Congress, not even David Perdue could stand in its way. And when it passed, the House, he tweeted, quote, President Trump is right. I support the push for $2,000 in direct relief to the American people. I could barely believe that because I followed this debate, and I know that Perdue was one of the chief opponents of direct payments in the past in Washington. He even bragged in a town hall not that long ago that he, quote, fought against the direct payment program of $1,200 and maintained throughout this crisis that he was, quote, personally opposed to any direct payments to Americans. And Perdue, hours later, was joined by Kelly Loeffler, making 2 of the 4 Republican senators who backed checks. So what can we learn? It's this. Even corporate ghouls, when something is clean and on their desk and they have no excuses to vote against something, they can stand in the way of something like $2,000 checks when their election is on the line. You can despair over that, or you can rejoice. And I choose the latter because it shows us that their ideology is actually fake. That when you bring real political pressure to bear, you can force these people to do what is both right and in the best interest politically. At the end of the day, that's how you win. Politicians are cynical people. Take a look at all the Republicans that have signed on to efforts to challenge the election results if you think I'm wrong. The only way to win is to make the cynical choice be the same as the right choice. Don't give them excuses. Don't allow your partisan representatives to stack something one way or the other. And in time, they will bend. I'm fully confident that without McConnell's machinations here, the $2,000 checks would have passed at a high margin through the Senate. Not even a majority of Senate Republicans are dumb enough to vote against it, despite being anathema to their ideology. There's hope in that story, so let's make it happen more. And that was, I think, the only inspiring part about the checks debate. Sitting and watching Purdue, and I was like, oh, God. But I mean, I was like, wow. He said he's going to vote for these checks. And he's in a special election, couldn't even get 50% of the vote 51% of the vote down in Georgia. Kelly Loeffler is like, I support. It's like the MAGA thing to do now to support $2,000 checks. Hey, great, right? And this is what
make it the cynical move.
What I wanted Trump to do for his entire presidency, and he never did. And, fleetingly did now and then threw it all away for no reason. But, again, there is hope within that story, which is if you have a situation where if Pelosi, she called their bluff, rightfully, I'm glad she did it.
Yeah.
$2,000 checks, straight up, nothing else, no extension.
Every Democrat except two voted for it,
Every
incredibly.
Democrat but two. What was it, 100 and something Republicans voted for? I can't remember.
40. It was only 40. I was actually surprised it was a relatively small number of Republicans, only 43.
Not idiots either.
But the point, if you look at it in another just years ago, just a short few years ago, you wouldn't have had any Republicans voting for this thing whatsoever. So there's so much that's instructive here. First of all, that McConnell would, and he truly has, put his hold on the Senate majority in jeopardy over this thing.
He has.
I mean, he's calculated that by bundling this together and muddying the water and being able to give Purdue and Loeffler some kind of talking point that they supported the $2,000 checks, he's betting that that's enough cover for them. I'm not sure that it is. We're about to find out whether that was actually sufficient.
Yes.
Trump's behavior here, completely instructive. Of course, he comes in at the last, after his administration and Steve Mnuchin negotiated the terrible deal that was
sat out.
That passed.
It was completely missing.
Completely sat out. Then at the last minute is like, I'm going to veto it then he doesn't do anything to actually extract concessions. And that's the difference between the relatively small number of Republicans who ultimately got on board with $2,000 direct checks, clean with no bullshit attached, and the number that are signing up for his ridiculous, steal the election thing, because he's actually putting pressure on them on that thing. And so even with it being completely outrageous and baseless and insane, he can garner a lot of support for it because he's putting pressure on them. He never put pressure on them on any of this. Meanwhile, the Democrats, Pelosi actually did the right thing here. Shockingly, and as we always say on the show, we give credit where credit's due, no matter where it comes from, no matter what quarter. The Senate Democrats, on the other hand, Bernie Sanders made the right move and said, look, we're going to stay here. I'm going to hold up the National Defense Authorization Act. And almost all of them, I think there were 6 senators who voted alongside Bernie Sanders to not give Mitch McConnell his way. They just fold immediately in the face of any kind of pressure because what do they care about? All they really care about, they don't care about the checks. They care about getting their talking point. Democrats felt like they got their good talking point. Mitch McConnell felt like he got a good enough talking point. So that's the end of the story.
Yeah, and that's the despairing part. But like I said, look, at the end of the day, you got David Perdue to support $2,000 checks, and he can't put that back in the bag, right? I mean, he can try, but they're going to be screamed at, and his constituents are probably not going to forget it. Maybe they will. We'll see.
They may not be his constituents for much longer, by the way.
Yeah, they may not be his constituents, for a couple more days. We'll figure out how that goes tomorrow. But the way that I look at it is that you can actually see where these brief moments where you saw Lindsey Graham back $2,000 checks. You saw, I think it was Senator Fisher was talking about $2,000 checks. And then I saw, Marco Rubio and Holly.
Yeah.
And then you had Kelly and Locke, you only needed one more, and those things were going to pass the chamber.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they got this close. And so, yeah, look, victory in war and in politics is really about doing something like 90,000 times, and then you win on the first one. All anybody's going to remember you for is that win. But you can see here that a script is written for getting something like this actually passed. And in the future, if any politician or whomever wants to try and force these two things together, that's how you can do it. And I think that anybody who wants something like this to happen, you should be hopeful. And you can say, look, if we actually try and push this thing just like this through pass, and we know it actually has 75, 80% support, these people cannot vote against it. And if you figure out the parliamentary procedure and all that, you can actually get some stuff done here.
This is a point that Rachel made a lot last week, which I think is really instructive, not only for this debate, but also ties into the force the vote debate over forcing a Medicare for all vote on the floor of the House. She's like, look, votes are important. Votes are powerful. Like, if you actually have a clean vote and everybody has to be on the record and they have to show their constituents what they are truly for and what they are truly against, then you can force change. And so I think that's precisely what we saw here. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell, figured out a way to have what Rachel also called failure theater, where everybody can sort of pretend like they fought this thing, but nobody really wanted to get it done. And so once again, the cynical bet ended up being the correct bet in the end.
Well, there we go. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.